The weathered tree stands alone on the windswept shore of Roanoke Island, its bark scarred with a single word carved deep into its flesh: croatoan. No bodies surrounded it, no signs of struggle, no clues beyond those 7 letters etched into living wood. In 1590, when Governor John White returned to the English settlement 3 years after leaving for supplies, he found only silence where 115 souls should have been waiting. America's first English colony had vanished without a trace, leaving behind emptied homes and abandoned possessions arranged with an eerie orderliness that suggested not panic, but deliberation. What truly happened to the lost colony of Roanoke remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. But beneath the commonly told tale of disappearance lies a darker narrative, one of desperation, madness, and horror that conventional histories have either overlooked or deliberately obscured. The settlement began with promise. In July 1587, 115 English colonists established a community on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. Among them were families dreaming of a new life, including John White's pregnant daughter Eleanor and her husband Ananias Dare. Within weeks of landing, Eleanor gave birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. But the timing could not have been worse. The settlers arrived too late in the growing season to establish crops. Relations with the indigenous Socotan people had been poisoned by the actions of a previous failed military expedition led by Ralph Lane, whose men had murdered the powerful chief Wingana. The colonists were inserted into an indigenous political landscape they barely comprehended, explains Dr. Mallory Harveston of the Coastal Archaeology Institute. Recent evidence suggests Lane's men had also engaged in horrific acts of torture against several Socotan villagers, creating a powder keg of resentment the peaceful settlers unknowingly inherited. As supplies dwindled, Governor White reluctantly sailed back to England for provisions in late August 1587, leaving behind his family and the other colonists with plans to return the following spring. His parting words to his daughter, recorded in his journal, carry an unintended poignancy. "Have faith, Eleanor. The winter will pass quickly, and I shall return before Virginia speaks her first words." He could not have known that war with Spain and the Spanish Armada would prevent his return for 3 long years. By then, his family and the entire colony had vanished. The traditional narrative ends there, with theories ranging from assimilation into friendly native tribes to massacre by hostile ones. But archaeological findings from the past decade, coupled with previously overlooked historical documents, paint a far more disturbing picture of Roanoke's final days. Soil samples taken from what archaeologists believe was the colony's main communal structure reveal traces of ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and causes hallucinations, convulsions, and psychosis when consumed. Dr. Thomas Harriot, a scientist on an earlier Roanoke expedition, had documented the colonists' plan to cultivate rye as one of their principal crops. Ergot poisoning could explain some of the more bizarre elements of the colony's endgame, notes forensic archaeologist Dr. Eliza Montgomery. The careful arrangement of personal items, the lack of signs of violence despite their disappearance, and what we now believe were ritualistic markings found at the perimeter of the settlement. These markings, discovered in 2018 using ground-penetrating radar, form concentric circles around the colony's boundaries. Within each circle, small pits were dug and filled with curious combinations of objects: broken pottery mixed with animal bones, children's toys paired with hunting knives, and in one disturbing instance, what DNA testing confirmed to be human teeth alongside English coins. John White's own papers, recently discovered in a private collection in Sussex, England, contain passages previously unknown to historians. In a letter written after his return to England but never sent, White describes something his official accounts omit. "The dwelling places stood as we left them, yet all about them the ground was turned and formed into strange patterns I cannot describe, but that they resembled the stars in their arrangement. Eleanor's cottage I found last, and there upon her table lay Virginia's baptismal cap, placed atop my own charts of the coastline, weighted down with stones arranged in a manner that seemed to hold meaning I could not decipher. God forgive me, but I burned both cap and chart together, for the sight filled me with such dread as I have never known. What drove the colonists to create such arrangements? Archaeological evidence suggests their final winter was one of unimaginable hardship. More troubling are the saw marks found on human bone fragments unearthed at the site's edge, consistent with flesh removal. We must consider the possibility that some colonists resorted to cannibalism, says historian Dr. James Morrow, not as an act of savagery, but of final, terrible necessity. The evidence suggests these weren't random acts, but carried out with a ritualistic precision that points to a colony in the grip of collective psychosis, possibly induced by starvation combined with ergot contamination. A 1603 account from Spanish captain Pedro de Zúñiga, long dismissed as propaganda, describes an encounter with a single English survivor found living among the Chesapeake tribes. The Englishman claims that God had abandoned them for their sins. As hunger weakened their bodies, strange visions plagued their minds. They became convinced salvation lay not in rescue, but in transformation. The carving of signs, the arranged objects, the terrible sacrifices, all were meant to open what he called doors to another world where they might escape death. In 2017, a team led by Dr. Samantha Wilkes discovered a previously unknown manuscript in the archives of the Spanish Inquisition, a report filed by a Dominican friar who interviewed Zúñiga upon his return. The friar's assessment is clinical in its horror. The captain relates that the heretic settlement destroyed itself through ungodly rituals after hunger drove them to madness. The survivor Thomas described how they became convinced their only salvation was to shed their physical forms, first through the sharing of blood in communion, later through the consumption of the dead, and finally through a mass ritual wherein the remaining colonists walked into the deep waters, believing they would emerge transformed. Only Thomas refused at the final hour, fleeing inland to live among the heathens rather than join what he called the surrender. If these accounts are accurate, the colonists didn't simply disappear, they chose oblivion through a collective psychosis-fueled ritual suicide. Not all historians accept this dark interpretation. Dr. Roland Thorpe of Colonial Williamsburg argues, "We must be cautious about sensationalizing the limited evidence. These people were practical Elizabethans, not members of an apocalyptic cult. Starvation and disease remain the most likely culprits, with survivors probably absorbed into indigenous populations." Yet the physical evidence grows more compelling. Aside from pieces of pottery, in 2021, marine archaeologists discovered remnants of what appears to be intentionally placed English artifacts in a deep-water trench 2 miles offshore from Roanoke. Spoons, candlesticks, and a child's doll arranged in a perfect circle at a depth the colonists could never have reached through conventional means. How these objects came to rest in such an arrangement, in such a location, defies conventional explanation. Eleanor White. Dare's rumored fate offers perhaps the most unsettling possibility. While the famous Dare stones discovered in the 1930s have largely been dismissed as hoaxes, a single stone found decades earlier and largely forgotten in the collection of the Smithsonian has recently been authenticated as dating to the appropriate period. Its crude inscription, only partially decipherable, reads, "Eleanor and child walked into the water at midnight. Others followed. Believe passage opens when tell Father forgive us." The most disturbing evidence emerged in 2022 when drought conditions revealed previously submerged portions of the coastline. There, a team from East Carolina University documented a series of stepping stones leading from the original colony site directly into the deepest part of Albemarle Sound. Carved into each stone was a single letter, together spelling passage. Whatever happened at Roanoke, observes Dr. Montgomery, we're facing the possibility that it wasn't something done to the colonists, but something they chose to do themselves. That's far more unsettling than a massacre or simple assimilation. Why would an entire colony choose such a fate? Contemporary accounts of life in Elizabethan England might offer a clue. Many colonists came from religious backgrounds that viewed hardship as divine punishment and sought meaning in suffering. When faced with starvation and abandoned by both England and their god, this worldview could have twisted into something much darker. The mystery of Roanoke may never be fully solved, but the evidence increasingly suggests a fate far more complex and terrifying than simple disappearance. It speaks to the fragility of civilization when faced with isolation and deprivation, and the dark places the human mind can go when pushed beyond endurance.